This video is going to be about cellular respiration, but in order to understand cellular respiration, you have to make sure you are completely understanding of what goes on in photosynthesis, because they are sister, and they are so similar that if you understand one, then understanding the other one is so much easier. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit and do photosynthesis really quickly. The equation. So for photosynthesis, 3 things, and from that they're going to make 2 things. Okay. So the things that they need, we call them reactants. That they make, we call products. All right. So what they need, you have to give a plant water, so call it H2O. You have to give a plant carbon dioxide, CO2, and you have to give them some form of light. And what we learned in a previous video is that blue light and red light, those wavelengths are their very, very favorite. Okay, so that's what they prefer, and they actually reject green. Now, from these 3 things, they're going to make the byproduct oxygen, so that's just their waste product, and then they're going to make what they really want, which is a C3H6O3 plus another C3H6O3. Okay, so they're going to make 2 of those. So the balanced equation is 6 waters, 6 carbon dioxides, and light will give you 6 oxygens, and 2 of these, or 1 glucose. All right, now when you flip it around, cellular respiration requires 2 reactants, 3 products. So it's just the reverse. So this is 3 reactants, 2 products. This is 2 reactants, 3 products. Respiration is necessary for energy. All right, so and this whole process is why we eat. Okay, we eat for energy. So when we eat our food, the C6H12O6, the glucose, is basically what we're breaking down. Now we can break down some proteins and some other things, but our body turns it typically into some sort of form of sugar. All right, so you learned about carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are CH&O, and they are used for energy. So from that process, your body needs oxygen, so we need food and oxygen to live. And from these 2 reactants, your body is going to break it down, and this is its waste product. So we have opposite waste products. All right, so our waste product is CO2. Plant's waste product is oxygen. So we eat food and use oxygen. We break it down, release carbon dioxide. We actually release a little bit of water. And then from that, we don't make sunshine, but we make something called ATP, which is energy. And you learned about the structure of that on a previous video. Okay, so here is the thing about these 2 processes. The reactants are the same as the products. Okay, well, we don't make sunshine, we make energy. So light and energy are the same. So the reactants and the products are the same. And then here, what you need, your reactants for cellular respiration, are the products. So these 2 processes are intimately combined and depend completely upon each other. So there's an argument about which one's more important and which one comes first. And plants came first. Okay, so because plants came, they could take all that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it into oxygen. And once they were able to allow for enough accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere, then other animals and stuff started showing up. But plants came first, and then came your cellular respiration. Now, we've got the chloroplast. We have a very similar organelle called a mitochondria for cellular respiration. All right, so photosynthesis, we've got water in, we've got light in, and we've got CO2 in. Mitochondria, we get CO2 out and we get ATP out. So there's our energy. Chloroplast releases oxygen, makes glucose. Mitochondria needs glucose and needs oxygen. So you get the opposite things going on here. Now, chloroplast has these little internal stacks in them called thylakoid. The mitochondria has this one inner membrane, and it's called the cristae. Okay, the middle of the mitochondria, they call it the matrix. Okay, now the cool thing about these two organelles is they are about the same size. They have their own DNA, and they have their own ribosomes. So they are pretty much self-sufficient inside of the cell. And these two organelles of the endosymbiotic theory. And the endosymbiotic theory is that these two organelles actually were bacteria or some sort of single-celled organism that was engulfed by a larger cell and actually provided a service and a benefit, so it was allowed to stay. So when a plant cell divides, the chloroplast can actually, they divide on their own, just like a bacteria cell, okay? And then mitochondria do the same thing. So inside your cells and inside plant cells and earthworm cells and trees and everything, you have mitochondria that divide on their own. And they have their own DNA, have their own ribosomes. So they essentially behave like their own little tiny organism. So the cycle constantly goes around from a plant to an animal. Okay? So the plant's going to give us oxygen, and they're going to give us glucose. And then from that, we're going to release carbon dioxide, and we're going to release water. So they're actually more important to us than we are to them, but these are your key things that we need, and then the plants need that. They can get the water from other sources. All right? I'm going to go back to this formula really quickly, and I want to show you one thing that's kind of cool. In this process of photosynthesis, you should have learned that the light reaction makes ATP, and the ATP is necessary to run the Calvin cycle, which makes this sugar. One glucose cost, and I'll put a little dollar sign there. So like if you were a factory, it cost you $18 to make one glucose, right? Or 18 ATP. So that's what the plant cell uses to make a sugar molecule. When it gets broken down, because plants also do cellular respiration, okay? So don't forget that they do both. We can only do the bottom reaction, but plants can do both. So they actually can create it for $18. But when they break it down, this is the amazing thing. They actually, for something that cost 18 ATP for them to make, they can get 38 ATP out of the process, okay? So now we use 2, so we end up with a total of 36 ATP. But for 8, that's like a very awesome return on your investment. If it costs you $18 to make a product and then you can sell it for $36, that's a win, okay? You're making money all day long. So plants are the best business people on the planet. They know what they're doing here. All right, so cellular respiration. All right, we're going to talk mainly about aerobic, okay? Because aerobic is most common, and this is how most say respiration, and this is also, we'll put preferred. So if an animal can do the other type, it still would prefer to do aerobic, okay? And the other one is anaerobic. And anaerobic means without something, and this part aerobic means with oxygen. Organisms that do anaerobic respiration have a very cool adaptation, and so they've learned to live in an environment where it's very low or no oxygen, because most things cannot live there. All right, over here, aerobic is the preferred, most efficient, and in the ultimate end, this is the one that gives you the 38 ATP, okay? Anaerobic keeps you alive, but in the end, after all of the process, you only get 2 ATP out of it. So if we're talking money, you'd rather get your $38 than your $2, okay? So we're going to compare the two basically with their steps, and then I'm going to do another video where I talk specifically about what happens in aerobic, because that's the most important, and then I'll run down what anaerobic does, okay? Now, they both start with the same first step, okay? So aerobic has 3 steps, and anaerobic actually, okay, so they both start with something called glycolysis, or what the organism does glycolysis. And lysis, L-Y-S-I-S, means to split, and glyco means sugar. So that first step is when you split glucose. The glucose molecule in half, snap it in half so that it's smaller, and I'll show you some images of that in just a little while. All right, so the second step of aerobic is a cycle, just like in photosynthesis. The second step is a cycle, but this one's going to be called Krebs cycle, so it's named after Mr. Krebs. And then the third step is abbreviated ETC. Some books abbreviate it ETS. Doesn't matter, okay? It stands for electron transport chain or system. Exactly what it sounds like. It's going to transport electrons and move them and create a lot of energy, okay? So glycolysis gives us 4 ATP, but it uses 2 ATP. So step 1 glycolysis gives us 2 ATP, okay? Same thing over here, okay? 2 ATP from glycolysis. Krebs cycle only gives us 2 more ATP. So right now we're only working on 4 ATP. So this third step is where all of the energy comes from, but it cannot occur unless 1 and 2 occur, and this gives you 32 ATP, okay? So the grand total is 2, 2, and 32, which is 36 ATP, because I already subtracted out the 2 that we used. So cost us 2 to do the process, so we end up with 36 ATP. All right, that's all well and good. So we'll kind of draw a line here down the middle, because everything over there is aerobic with oxygen. Okay, and that's why you breathe in oxygen, because it helps you do this process much more efficiently. But if for some reason an organism can do anaerobic, and you actually have cells in your body that can, all right, and I'm going to talk about your cells in your body that can, and they're muscle cells. Now, this is temporary, and this is what happens to you when you exercise and you get to a point where you're just breathing heavy and you're running out of oxygen. Muscle cells can temporarily perform anaerobic respiration. So the muscle cell, the mitochondria, does glycolysis, but then it shifts into anaerobic. And the second step, it does lactic, acid fermentation. All right, so lactic acid fermentation, and this is that acid that builds up in your muscles and it makes them sore. So if you're in really good shape, you don't go into lactic acid fermentation very quickly, and so your muscles don't get sore. But if when you first start exercising, you're breathing heavy, you can't get oxygen to your muscles, so the muscle cells have to go into this mode, and so the cells don't die, and they do lactic acid fermentation. And so after it's all said and done, your muscles are sore, all right? So these are animal cells. The other cells that can do this, bacteria can do it, all right? And bacteria, if you shut off their supply of oxygen, they'll just shift into fermentation, and they can actually use this process and make yogurt. So when you eat yogurt, you're actually eating bacteria that have been trapped with sugars and milk and fruit, and the bacteria eat them and release this lactic acid, and it turns all of that into yogurt. And that's why they're called live cultures, because they're actually in there, and they're good bacteria. They're good, very healthy bacteria for your digestive tract. Okay, so one type of anaerobic is lactic acid fermentation. Let me highlight that so that you won't forget that's what that is. All right, so that's the second step if you're a bacteria or a muscle cell. No other cells in your body can do this. And then the other one, the only organism on earth that can do this are yeast, and it's called alcoholic fermentation. All right, and what they do is, in the absence of oxygen, they will do glycolysis, but then their second step is alcoholic fermentation. And what they do is they take their food and they release ethyl alcohol. And so this is how wine, beer, liquor, all those alcohols are made, is they take different food and they feed it to yeast. So like for wine, they would take grapes and yeast and sugar and mix them together in a barrel, and they allow these yeast to eat this fruit, and it makes alcohol. So if it eats red grapes, you have your red wine. If it eats hops and barley, it might be beer. If it's grain, corn, things like that, it'll make a different type of alcohol. But what you're really drinking is the waste product of yeast. And they are the only organism on earth that can make alcohol. All right, and so both of these processes keep the organism alive, but they only make 2 ATP, and they both release carbon dioxide. So you're breathing heavy, barrels of alcohol make a lot of carbon dioxide, so that carbon dioxide has to be released. Beer has a lot of CO2 in it, so it's carbonated. So these are your two main steps, your two main types of respiration: aerobic, preferred, most common, most efficient, and then anaerobic, life-saving, if your cells can do it, or a beautiful adaptation so that an organism can live in an extreme environment.